From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
No, without a house, I have nothing. I have nothing. My house is ruined. It's destroyed and over there.
From the U.S. Virgin Islands to Puerto Rico to Florida, millions of Americans remain without power following Hurricane Irma. We'll look at how Puerto Rico's economic crisis has hurt the island's recovery and at how Cuba has responded to the storm. Even though Irma was a Category 5 when it hit Cuba, the government reports just 10 people have died. We'll look at why many nations study Cuba's hurricane preparedness. According to one study, a person is 15 times as likely to be killed by a hurricane in the United States as in Cuba. And even though they were hard hit, Cuba sent over 750 doctors and health professionals throughout the Caribbean during the storm. Then to a storm of silence.
Harvey is threatening millions of Texans with catastrophic flooding.
The monumental flooding and humanitarian disaster continues.
Tonight, Houstonians are still under siege in a city still underwater.
A new study by Public Citizen looks at how much of the corporate media failed to mention climate change during its coverage of Hurricane Harvey. Then we go to Houston to look at mutual aid and rescue efforts after Harvey.
We have to go and distribute the goods, but we also have to go and distribute the care. People are still being ignored actively because they've been passed by someone, because someone has handed them a thing. They've decided that all their problems are fixed. And that's not possible under late capitalism.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As many as 13 million people remain without power in Florida as the state begins to survey the widespread damage caused by Hurricane Irma. At least 11 people died on the mainland U.S. from the hurricane. Authorities say some parts of the Florida Keys may be inaccessible for weeks. The U.S. military is now helping evacuate some Florida Keys residents who did not leave before the storm. Jacksonville experienced its worst flooding since 1864. The storm also caused destruction when it swept across Georgia and South Carolina Monday. In Puerto Rico, hundreds of thousands of people remain without power. Authorities have warned parts of Puerto Rico could be without electricity for up to 6 months. The head of FEMA, Brock Long, announced this morning he's heading to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands today. The death toll from the storm also rose in the Caribbean, where at least 34 people are confirmed dead. 10 in Cuba, where Irma hit the northern coast as a Category 5 storm. It was the deadliest hurricane in Cuba since 2005. We'll have more on Hurricane Irma in Puerto Rico and Cuba after headlines. In Texas, authorities say Hurricane Harvey is responsible for causing nearly 500,000 gallons of gasoline to spill from 2 storage tanks, marking the largest spill so far from the devastating storm. The 460,000 gallons were released from a petroleum tank farm operated by Magellan Midstream Partners in Texas, just east of Houston. Some of the spilled gasoline contaminated a waterway alongside the Houston Ship Channel. Hurricane Harvey killed 70 people and caused widespread environmental contamination. The Center for Biological Diversity reports flooded oil refineries and chemical plants released as much as 5 million pounds of pollutants into the air during the storm. Pope Francis has spoken out forcefully against climate change denial. Speaking to reporters Sunday as he flew over Caribbean islands decimated by Hurricane Irma, Pope Francis said humans must make progress in tackling climate change and called those who continue to deny its existence stupid.
We will not go backwards. We will go down. That is true. Climate change, you feel the effects. The scientists tell us clearly the road to take. All of us have a responsibility. All of us. Some small, some big. A moral responsibility to not accept it, to give one's opinion, or to make decisions. And we have to take it seriously. I think it is something we cannot joke about. Whoever denies this must go to the scientists and ask them. They speak very clearly. The scientists are precise. Man is stupid. A head that does not see.
The Pope was speaking with a Band-Aid on his eyebrow and a black eye because he hit his head on the Pope-mobile while traveling in Colombia. The United Nations Security Council has imposed a new round of sanctions on North Korea. The resolution was drafted and pushed for by the United States. It seeks to further cripple North Korea's economy by limiting North Korea's oil imports, banning its textile exports, and imposing other restrictions on the nation's economy. Ahead of Monday's Security Council vote, North Korea warned the U.S. it could face retaliation if it pushed for the harsh sanctions. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is calling for a new round of negotiations with North Korea, advocating for a diplomatic alternative to the rising military tensions between North Korea and the U.S. Merkel highlighted the role Germany played in brokering the landmark Iran nuclear deal and said, quote, "I could imagine such a format being used to end the North Korea conflict," unquote. The Trump administration's moving forward with its pledge to stop the closure of Guantanamo Bay Naval Prison. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has announced the position of the special envoy for closure of the Guantanamo detention facility would be eliminated. The Pentagon has proposed spending $500 million in new construction at Guantanamo. The U.S. is currently imprisoning 41 people indefinitely at Guantanamo Bay. Cuba was hard hit by Hurricane Irma. Former White House Chief Strategist Stephen Bannon says Trump's decision to fire FBI Director James Comey was the biggest political mistake in modern history. Bannon, now the chair of the far-right Breitbart Media, made the comments while speaking with 60 Minutes' Charlie Rose.
Someone said to me that you described the firing of James Comey, you're a student of history, as the biggest mistake in political history.
That would probably be too bombastic even for me, but maybe modern political history.
This clip didn't actually appear in the 60 Minutes piece. They posted it online Sunday night. The Wall Street Journal is reporting some of President Trump's lawyers have recommended White House senior advisor Jared Kushner should step down over concerns about his meetings with Russian officials during the campaign. Kushner is also President Trump's son-in-law. Kushner met multiple times with Russian officials and businessmen during Trump's campaign. The meetings are now part of the multiple investigations into the Trump campaign's ties to Russia. In international news, in Barcelona, 1 million people poured into the streets Monday to demand independence for Catalonia. The march increases pressure on Spain ahead of an independence referendum on Catalan independence on October 1st. This is protester Eva Salacher.
We've come for another year to fight for what we believe in, for our own interests. We are people with our own identity and language. What we cannot have is the oppression we have been experiencing so far, and we want to be able to have a democratic and peaceful vote.
In France, dozens of unions are on strike today, with 200 demonstrations planned nationwide to protest French President Emmanuel Macron's plans to roll back labor protections by presidential decree. The strikes are disrupting key industries, including travel, with more than 100 flights canceled and trains suspended. In Brazil, authorities are investigating reports that gold miners brutally murdered 10 indigenous people last month and later bragged about dismembering their bodies. The alleged murders occurred in the Amazon's Javari Valley, Brazil's second-largest indigenous reserve. The victims were members of an uncontacted tribe. Brazilian President Michel Temer has close ties to the mining industry, and earlier this year he issued a decree opening up a wide swath of the Amazon to mining and extraction. He's also cut funding for government agencies that work to protect indigenous groups from attacks by miners and loggers. In India, a caravan of peace activists has arrived in the capital, Delhi, as part of a month-long journey across India to highlight the rise of lynchings and violence against Muslims, Dalits, and other minority groups. Led by the activist Harsh Mander, the caravan is leading with families of the victims of hate crimes, which have risen sharply under Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Data from the group India Spend shows some anti-Muslim hate crimes have risen tenfold since Modi came to power in 2014. In Egypt, at least 18 police officers were killed in an ISIS attack on the Sinai Peninsula Monday. It was one of the deadliest attacks this year in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Back in the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court has temporarily lifted restrictions on President Trump's travel ban, meaning about 24,000 refugees may now be barred from entering the United States. Last week, an appeals court in Seattle ruled tens of thousands of refugees who had received promises of assistance from refugee resettlement organizations should be allowed to enter. But on Monday, the Supreme Court intervened to block this ruling. The Supreme Court is soon expected to issue a fuller ruling on the ban, which blocks refugees and all citizens of 6 majority Muslim nations from entering the United States. In New Hampshire, authorities are investigating an apparent attempted lynching in the town of Claremont. A mother says her 8-year-old biracial child had to be airlifted to the hospital after a group of white teenagers reportedly hung him from a tree. She also posted photographs on Facebook showing the injuries to the child's neck. The child's grandmother also says the white teenagers were taunting the child with racial slurs before the attack. The town of Claremont is 96% white. And in Texas, at least 8 people are dead after a man allegedly killed his estranged wife and her friends in what appears to be the deadliest incident of domestic violence in the town's history. On Sunday, 27-year-old Meredith Height was watching the Cowboys football game with a group of friends and family in the Dallas suburb of Plano when her estranged husband reportedly entered her house and opened fire, killing her and 7 other adults. The shooter was killed by police. Local news reports Height had filed for divorce in July. Height's mother said her daughter, quote, loved hosting friends and family. This was her first opportunity to do it after the divorce. And he, referring to her estranged husband, didn't take it well. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our friends and all of our viewers around the country and around the world. From the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico to Florida and Georgia, millions of Americans remain without electricity as they attempt to recover from the devastating Hurricane Irma. On the island of St. John in the Virgin Islands, 80% of homes have been severely damaged. 5,000 U.S. service members are being sent to the Virgin Islands to help with relief efforts as drinking water and food begin to run out. In Puerto Rico, hundreds of thousands of people remain without power. Authorities have warned parts of Puerto Rico could be without electricity for up to 6 months. FEMA Administrator Brock Long will travel to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands today. In Florida, meanwhile, as many as 13 million people have been left without power. Some parts of the Florida Keys may be inaccessible for weeks. The U.S. military is now helping evacuate some Florida Keys residents who did not leave before the storm. Jacksonville is recovering from its worst flooding since 1864. The destruction from Irma also stretched into Georgia and South Carolina.
Meanwhile, one of the Caribbean islands hardest hit was Cuba, where 10 people died. Irma hit Cuba's northern coast as a Category 5 storm. It was the deadliest hurricane in Cuba since 2005, when 16 people died in Hurricane Dennis. Cuba has long been viewed as a world leader in hurricane preparedness and recovery. According to the Center for International Policy, a person is 15 times as likely to be killed by a hurricane in the United States as in Cuba. Meanwhile, Cuba has already sent more than 750 doctors and health workers to Antigua, Barbuda, St. Kitts, Nevis, St. Lucia, the Bahamas, Dominica, and Haiti. We begin today's show with Elizabeth Newhouse, director of the Center for International Policy's Cuba Project. She's taken numerous delegations from the U.S. to Cuba to see how the Cubans manage disaster preparedness. Elizabeth, welcome to Democracy Now! You grew up in Cuba?
Yes, I did.
So
I was a child there in the 50s.
Can you talk about what happened in Cuba first, and then we'll talk about their record in hurricane preparedness and what we can learn from them?
Well, as you just mentioned, the hurricane made landing on the north coast, down towards the east and then skirted the coast all the way up close to Havana, did not reach Havana, and then headed north. So the brunt of it was felt across the island, but the worst part was down around the area of Camagüey and other towns down in that area. And they were really, truly very, very badly hurt. Havana was had waves coming up over the seawall, apparently that reached something like 32 feet, and horrific flooding that went in 5 or 7 blocks. People were up to their shoulders in some areas in water. So it was huge amounts of flooding. However, 10 people died, as you mentioned, which is an enormous number of people for Cuba because of the tremendous preparation that they do. Normally, people do not die in hurricanes in Cuba, or if they do, they're just a very, very small number.
Well, when you say that normally very few people die in hurricanes in Cuba, why is that, given the fact that Cuba is not a wealthy country? It's had all kinds of economic problems. What is it about the government's preparedness that is so distinct from what happens in the rest of the Caribbean or even in the United States?
Well, it is distinct because they have an ingrained culture of prevention and preparedness that is really quite unique, and it is very rigorously followed. And children learn from a very, very early age that disasters will happen. Their lessons are included throughout all their years growing up, and they really expect these things to happen, and they know what to do when they do happen. Cuba has been hit with hurricanes so many times, not only hurricanes, but major tropical storms, which bring huge amounts of flooding and sea surge. And they have to be ready for it. So they are ready, and they save enormous numbers of lives by massive evacuations. I think this time they evacuated 1 million people. And even though the infrastructure is poor and many of the houses are very poor, their focus is on saving lives.
Now, also, you studied their preparedness. Could you talk about the impact of things like neighborhood mapping that they do, of who exactly lives in what neighborhood, and the role that the neighborhood groups, the committees for defense of the revolution, play in disasters like this?
Yes, well, they have all the neighborhoods mapped. They know exactly who lives where. They know who the vulnerable people are, and they know who the elderly people are and where they live. And a couple of days before the hurricane hits, they evacuate them all. They start with those people. Pregnant women get put in hospitals. People with infirmities get also put in hospitals. Others get taken to either shelters or with family or friends who are living in more secure houses. But everybody in Cuba knows what they're going to do if a hurricane hits. Everybody has a plan, whether it's to go to a family or friend or whether it's to go to a shelter. So there's no sort of haphazard organizing at the last minute. It's very, very well thought out. The civil defense system controls it all. The president of the civil defense is the president of the country, or the head of the civil defense. And it's very tightly organized from the bottom up and from the top down. It's really a very impressive thing to see, and the results are really quite astounding, even though the material damage is always horrific. And I mean, I think they're still trying to find ways to house people who were displaced in the last hurricane. So, you know, what they're going to do this time, I don't know. And they're putting a big emphasis on trying to get the tourism infrastructure back, because tourism is so desperately important to the economy. So they're going to be putting a lot of focus on rebuilding resorts along the north coast that were very badly hurt. That's the area where most of the resorts are. and they were hugely damaged, and they want to get them up and running before the big tourism season begins in a couple of months. So I think people are wondering what's going to happen. What's going to happen to individuals who are in shelters now? How long will they have to be there? It'll probably be quite some time.
And what about, well, I wanted to turn to just some of the voices of people in Cuba, east of Havana and the fishing village of Jojimar. Many fishermen found their boats and equipment destroyed. This is fisherman Ernesto Rivero.
In this area here, all the boats were finished. The swell entered, the waves went up. That's what did the most damage, the waves and the wind. This part ends with many bushes. It carried a lot of small houses. It destroyed a lot of roofs. In this part below Jojimar, there are total collapses of the houses and all that.
Havana residents Margarita Halzik and Miladies Cardoso also spoke about the impact of Hurricane Irma on Havana.
As you can see, everything got wet, because although we tried to raise some things, the doors broke and everything that was below was destroyed.
Very bad, lousy transportation. I'm doing a lot of work, the same to come to work as to go to the house. This is critical, this transport thing.
Just some of the voices of people in Cuba. Elizabeth Newhouse, the Cuban government, though the island was very hard hit, sending over 750 doctors, health professionals throughout the Caribbean. Can you talk about this policy they have? This is not new.
Yes, no, this is not new. They have this a kind of rapid response to disasters, and they go out. They've been to many places, including earthquakes in Pakistan and disasters in Central America, and it's really very impressive. They were among the first in Haiti when the earthquake hit, however many years ago that was, and they're very good. They're very well trained. This is an area that they're just superb at, and they go help other people despite their own problems.
I wanted to ask you about the U.S.-Cuba relations. In June, Donald Trump announced that he would reverse the normalization of relations between the U.S. and Cuba and reimposing the travel and trade restrictions less than a year after President Obama relaxed the decades-old embargo on the island.
Our new policy begins with strictly enforcing U.S. law. We will not lift sanctions on the Cuban regime until all political prisoners are freed, freedoms of assembly and expression are respected, all political parties are legalized, and free and internationally supervised elections are scheduled. We will very strongly restrict American dollars flowing to the military, security, and intelligence services that are the core of the Castro regime. They will be restricted. We will enforce the ban on tourism. We will enforce the embargo.
That was President Trump reversing almost completely the President Obama's reopening toward Cuba. Your response?
In fact, he did not reverse it completely. They're cutting back on it, but we still have diplomatic relations with Cuba. He is trying to curtail people going to Cuba for tourism reasons, but he is not changing the ability to travel for a whole host of other reasons, including going down on cultural and educational trips. It's just that from now on, people have to go in tour groups rather than individually. So really, that's about, as far as travel is concerned, that's about the extent of it. Now, as far as dealing with the military, that's going to be curtailed. We do not know exactly what that means yet because the regulations that govern this new policy have not been issued. They're being written right now, and we expect to know what they are in the next few weeks. And what entities they consider military are going to be put on a list, and those are the ones that are going to be prohibited from having any monetary connection with. But, you know, there's so many military entities in Cuba. Are they going to be, how open is that policy going to be, or how tight it's going to be? And that's going to depend on what the regulations look like. So we don't know yet.
And will there still be direct flights between the U.S. and Cuba that happened after President Obama changed the policy?
The bilateral relationship is still there. The problem is that there's kind of a much more kind of hostile approach. When President Obama was there, he was trying very hard to open lots of different avenues, and now that's kind of slammed shut. So while it's certainly possible to do business down there still, it's going to be tougher and tighter. And at the same time, Cuba is going through a transition because President Raul Castro is retiring in the early part of 2018, and who is going to succeed him is as yet unknown. So there's a fair amount of jockeying for his job, and I think they feel that being seen as being too close to the U.S. is not good for them. So essentially, the relationship has quieted down considerably.
I mean, it's very interesting also in light of the fact that, well, a Newsweek investigation revealed before becoming president, Trump's businesses violated the U.S. embargo on Cuba, secretly doing business in Cuba in the late 90s, then trying to cover it up.
Yes, well, you know, Trump would like nothing more than to have a big hotel in Cuba, but he's got the very hardline Cuban Americans who are absolutely adamantly opposed to these Obama openings. I mean, it's a much, much smaller group than it used to be, but they tend to be wealthy and influential, and those are the ones he's listening to.
I mean, in fact, even a number of Republican governors have made trips to Cuba. U.S. corporations, you know, a lot of those that support the Republican Party have a different view on Cuba. And aren't the hardline Cuban community in Florida much smaller? Even the Republican Cubans of the younger generation want some kind of normalization.
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is in favor of lifting the embargo. They'd love to do business with Cuba. There's a lot of good business to be done. So, you know, it's kind of counterintuitive for Trump, who says he's a great businessman and a great deal maker, to be kind of slamming this door shut. But it has to do with this small group of Cuban Americans who are just adamantly, for reasons going back to the revolution, are just adamantly opposed to the Castro regime.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about the Trump administration moving forward with its plan to stop the closure of the Guantanamo prison. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson announcing the position of the special envoy for the closure of the Guantanamo detention facility will be eliminated. The Pentagon also proposing spending $500 million in new construction at Guantanamo. The U.S. currently imprisoning 41 people indefinitely there.
Well, that's true. During the campaign, I think Trump was adamant about keeping the prison opened. You know, we never expected Guantanamo to be handed back to the Cubans, which is the base, which is of course what they want. But this is really something quite new, and I think unfortunate. However, that's the Trump position.
We just have 30 seconds. What advice do you think President Castro could give to President Trump around hurricane preparedness or on any issue right now?
Well, certainly educating people, getting them ready for eventualities, and certainly preparing in a way that we've gotten much, much better at. And I think part of the reason we've gotten better at is we took We took 8 or 9 groups, delegations of emergency managers from Florida, from the Gulf Coast, from the Southeast, from the Panhandle down to Cuba over the years to introduce them to the Cuban system. And they all were extremely impressed. They all came back with ideas. And I think some of the much tighter preparedness that we're seeing in these recent hurricanes had to be influenced in some way by the Cuban model.
Well, we want to thank you, Elizabeth Newhouse, for joining us. Director of the Center for International Policy's Cuba Project has taken numerous delegations from the U.S. to Cuba to see how the Cubans manage disaster preparedness. Elizabeth Newhouse herself grew up in Cuba. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, Public Citizen has a report on the silence around the 24-hour coverage of the hurricanes, but where is the issue of climate change mentioned? And we'll talk about Puerto Rico, the powerlessness there. There were 1 million people who didn't have power, now down to 300,000. The head of FEMA is headed to go there today. Stay with us.
Como sembrando una flor al buen revolucionario, solo lo mueve el amor, solo lo mueve el amor. Dijo que para el humano que ningún intelectual.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Debe ser asalariado del pensamiento oficial, del pensamiento oficial.
Cuban singer Sylvia Rodriguez singing live at Central Park's Summer Stage on Sunday. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The FEMA administrator, Brock Long, is traveling today to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. He just announced this morning to see firsthand the damage caused by Hurricane Irma. On the island of St. John in the Virgin Islands, 80% of homes have been severely damaged. Meanwhile, in Puerto Rico, 300,000 people remain without power. Authorities have warned parts of Puerto Rico could be without electricity for up to 6 months, in part due to the island's economic crisis. Juan, you've been closely covering the situation in Puerto Rico. What does the hurricane have to do with the political crisis in Puerto Rico?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that the hurricane didn't really hit Puerto Rico head-on like it did in Cuba or even in the other Caribbean islands. It basically glanced of the island, and yet many people on the island were stunned to see the so much electricity go down. As you mentioned, at the beginning when the hurricane hit, about as many as 1 million people went without electricity, and about 1/3 of the people lost water because so many of the pumping stations, water pumping stations in Puerto Rico depend on the electrical grid for their power source, so that there are hundreds of thousands of people also without water on the island. And the reality is that the electrical system of Puerto Rico has been in crisis now for decades. And just one example, in the electrical company, which is a government-owned electrical company, it's called PREPA, the Puerto Rican Electric Power Authority, in 2000 had about 7,000 linemen to take care of repairs along the system. Today it has 3,500. 50% of the workforce has been reduced. And so when when even a hurricane like this gets near the island, it creates enormous devastation for the electrical system. And now this has become the basis for the attempts to privatize the electrical system, because the electrical company is the crown jewel of industry in Puerto Rico. Everybody needs electricity, especially in an island that is so hot and humid and is so industrialized, so that there's been efforts now to try to privatize PREPA. And of course, the source of how the electricity is generated in Puerto Rico is critical. One example, 51% of all the electricity in Puerto Rico is produced through burning petroleum, compared to less than 1% of all the electricity generated in the United States is generated through petroleum. In addition, coal and natural gas, fossil fuels amount for about 98% of the generating power of the electrical system in Puerto Rico. Very little wind or solar generation. So part of the problem is that Puerto Rico has the most expensive way of generating its electricity, and then there's no investment in the capital infrastructure or in the workforce. So anything like this, a hurricane like this, immediately creates a crisis that will be for months in order to be repaired.
Well, we'll continue to follow what's happening in Puerto Rico. Any final comments? And did you hear, you were born in Ponce, right? Did you hear how it was affected?
It wasn't affected. In fact, I talked to my sister who lives in Calle, in the center of the island, and they said they were surprised how little impact of the actual hurricane was on the island, yet everyone lost electricity.
Well, we're going to move on right now. Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Jose. Well, there's another storm brewing, a storm of silence. That's the title of a new report by the watchdog group Public Citizen, which looks at the media's failure to discuss climate change in its wall-to-wall hurricane coverage. While all the television networks commented on the magnitude of Hurricane Harvey and extreme weather, virtually none explained how warmer ocean temperatures lead to heavier winds and many other issues. David Arkesh is now with us. David Arkesh is the managing director of Public Citizen's climate program. Talk about what you found, David.
Sure. So we looked at coverage of Harvey for 8 days, starting when it first hit Texas. That was on a Friday, and running through the following Friday. And we found a few things. The most interesting, I think, are first, ABC and NBC News didn't mention climate change at all in the context of Hurricane Harvey. This is for an entire. We looked at 8 days. I updated the research. We looked. NBC still hasn't mentioned climate change in the context of any of its recent hurricane coverage. ABC still hasn't mentioned it. NBC finally got around to it on Saturday. After more than 2 weeks had passed since Harvey hit, and after we called them out on it with this report. Another major finding was that, and we looked at 18 media sources, so 10 newspapers, 3 news weeklies, 5 broadcast networks, and across all 18 sources, 72% of the mentions of climate change in the context of Hurricane Harvey came from just 4 of the sources. Those were CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Houston Chronicle. So the vast majority of the coverage was from a very small number of sources. If you live within a certain media bubble, and those are the sources that you watch or you read, you might have thought that the climate connection with Harvey was done pretty well in some of the media. It turns out outside that bubble, it was pretty awful.
Let's play a sampling of some of the news reports as Harvey made landfall in Texas.
Harvey is threatening millions of Texans with catastrophic flooding.
The monumental flooding and humanitarian disaster continues.
Tonight, Houstonians are still under siege in a city still underwater.
But Arkesh, what's going on here? I mean, we're not just talking about Fox. There are occasional mentions of climate change, extremely occasional, on MSNBC, on CNN. But given the wall-to-wall coverage, there is almost no mention of climate change.
That's right, and it actually reflects a broader problem, and this is why we're sort of policing this and watching what the media is doing, and we're going to be pushing them to do better. There's a general problem in this country of people not talking about climate change enough. It's sort of the biggest looming threat, and it's shocking. It's really shocking how few people are talking about it. There's research that suggests that only 43% of Americans report hearing about climate change in the media at least once a month. 57% will say that they hear about climate change in the media less than once a month or not at all. Only 19% of people report hearing people they know talk about climate change at least once a month. 28% of Americans report never hearing anyone they know talk about climate change. And this is something that, this is a terrible threat facing this country, really an existential threat that is much nearer and much more urgent than most people think. Most people think it's an issue that's going to affect people in faraway places. It's going to affect people 100 years from now or 200 years from now. That's all mistaken. It is going to hurt. It is already hurting people in the United States. It is going to hurt worse and worse, and it is going to pose potentially catastrophic existential threats to the United States as early as the second half of this century. It is very soon. We have very little time left to fight it. And meanwhile, we have great solutions. People just don't know about these things. And I think a lot of that starts with getting the media to report on it more.
Well, David, what about those who say that no single extreme weather event, such as Hurricane Harvey, can be directly attributed to climate change?
Well, that's absolutely right. It's a mistake to say that, to even pose the question, did climate change cause Hurricane Harvey, or did climate change cause this or that particular event? That's not how it works. Weather systems, climate systems are complex. What happens is climate change worsens and intensifies and contributes to these problems. So climate change contributes to a hurricane like Harvey in several ways. The three biggest and most obvious are climate change has raised the sea levels, and higher sea levels mean worse storm surges and worse flooding in general. Warmer oceans, climate change has warmed the oceans, and warmer oceans mean stronger winds in the hurricanes, and the winds can be very damaging. And finally, climate change has warmed the air temperature, and warmer air holds more moisture, makes it more humid, and that leads to more precipitation. So those are three major ways that climate change contributes to an event like Harvey and intensifies it and worsens it. The prediction is we get more intense hurricanes. It's not even clear we necessarily get more hurricanes overall. It's that when we have them, they will be worse.
Well, in a major piece about the Weather Channel, the New York Times reports, quote, "For weeks now, the network has broadcast live nonstop, first as Hurricane Harvey inundated Texas, and now as Irma menaces Florida. Yet in all the nonstop coverage, there was no mention of climate change and its role in creating extreme weather, not at the morning meeting and not at other planning sessions throughout the day. It's not that the Weather Channel ignores climate change altogether, but the words climate change don't appear in any promotional materials or show titles, and the phrase is only occasionally uttered on the air," unquote. The article goes on to quote the Weather Channel's David Schull, who's a Republican, saying, quote, "I believe in climate change and I believe it's man-made, but I'm not a big fan of the term. It's been politicized." Has the term been politicized?
Well, the term certainly has been politicized. At the same time, I don't think that means we shouldn't talk about it. I believe the same article actually suggests that it's actually a policy position. It's a policy at the Weather Channel not to mention climate change because they're afraid of alienating conservatives who watch the Weather Channel. I think that's a step too far. I understand trying to speak to people in a language that they'll be receptive to, but you can't ignore an important issue that's real and is so directly related to so many weather events and weather catastrophes. I think at some point there's just an obligation to talk about the truth.
In fact, the Weather Channel itself getting hit hard, being in Atlanta, and David Schull being the chief executive, completely acknowledging, as so many of the meteorologists do privately, that climate change is an issue, but saying they're catering to their audience.
That's absolutely right. And I just think, well, first of all, at least as of now, it's not as if there is a right-wing alternative to the Weather Channel where the viewers are going to go. It's not as if, you know, if people don't like CNN's coverage and think it's too liberal for reporting facts, they can go watch Fox News and be lied to if they want. You know, that's not really the case with the Weather Channel, and I think the Weather Channel ought to do its job and report the truth. You know, we already have enough problems with, you know, for example, an EPA administrator who doesn't want to talk about the truth and talk about science. We don't need our news reporting agencies and down to our weather reporters essentially making political decisions not to talk about reality.
How much do you think the fact that the fossil fuel industry sponsors the networks, along with the weapons manufacturers and others, these are corporate networks, you know, you'll see Jake Tapper's The Lead brought to you by the American Petroleum Institute. How much do you think that determines how little is said about climate change?
You know, I'm sure it plays some role. At this point, I'd almost want to say it probably plays a role in the margins because there's so little coverage. That there aren't very many, I wouldn't say there are very many opportunities for those sponsors to get upset about it.
I wanted to ask you about a remark that on the Friday, the former EPA administrator Christine Todd Whitman wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times titled "How Not to Run the EPA." In it, she writes that the current EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, recently unveiled a plan that amounts to a slow-rolling catastrophe in the making, the creation of an antagonistic red team of dissenting scientists to challenge the conclusions reached by thousands of scientists over decades of research on climate change. It will serve only to confuse the public and sets a deeply troubling precedent for policymaking at the EPA. This is Christy Todd Whitman, a Republican, former administrator of the same agency. Your reaction?
Well, I think she's absolutely right. I think this notion of doing a red team, blue team exercise on climate science is really absurd. Scott Pruitt was talking about this kind of thing around the time he got confirmed. He has sort of a new form of climate denial where he says, you know, I'm not denying that it's happening. I'm just saying we don't understand it well enough, and we need to learn more about it and debate it more before we act on it. And he was saying that we should be having a big conversation about this, a big public conversation. We should be talking about it in the high schools, and we should be talking about it in the Congress. And I mean, with all respect, no, it's actually scientists who should be debating that, and they have, and they've reached a conclusion, and it's clear what the science is. And if you're not going to accept what the scientists have to say about it, then the debate never has to end. Right? The debate will go on and on and on if you're going to actually reject conclusive, authoritative evidence on one side. And that is what Scott Pruitt is doing. This isn't a debate, it's a filibuster. Right? This is a multi-decade filibuster brought to you by the fossil fuel industry, of which he is basically a part. And he is just continuing that.
Our videographer, Hani Massoud, was flying back from Houston, our coverage of Hurricane Harvey, watching Fox on the plane, and there was the image of the Hurricane Irma bearing down on the Caribbean and Texas, and Florida. And at the same time, the image of President Trump speaking in Mandan, North Dakota, where so many Native Americans have been arrested for protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. And he was celebrating the fact that he had pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord and green-lighted both the Dakota Access Pipeline and Keystone XL. Last comments, David Arkish, in this 30 seconds.
Well, on Trump, I will say, you know, he is obviously on course to be probably the worst president in American history, and there are innumerable scandals surrounding him. He may even be impeached. We'll see what happens. I think if there is a history 200, 300, 500 years from now, he will possibly be remembered most for his terrible decisions on climate change. Really a turning point in U.S. history. He's turning the wrong way and heading us down a path toward disaster when this is a problem that we could actually come together and fix.
David Arkish, I want to thank you for being with us, Managing Director of Public Citizen's Climate Program, author of the new report, A Storm of Silence, Media Coverage of Climate Change and Hurricane Harvey. We'll link to it at DemocracyNow.org. When we come back, mutual aid, decentralized help in communities. Stay with us.
Chains to a light, do which is
Rise like lions here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we end today's show in Houston, Texas, 2 weeks after Hurricane Harvey caused historic flooding and left residents to coordinate with each other to rescue thousands of people who were left stranded when officials were overwhelmed. Now that volunteer spirit of mutual aid has continued in the storm's aftermath.
Democracy Now!'s Renee Feltz joins us now with a report from her hometown of Houston on how some of the many Houstonians who form decentralized networks to clean out flooded homes, feed thousands who lost everything, and offer much-needed counseling. Welcome back, Renee. Why don't you set up this piece for us?
Thanks, Amy. It's great to be back in New York. Like many people who live in Houston and the Gulf Coast, I feel like I'm going through a bit of PTSD. I didn't have a good time. It was good to see people down there, but it's a long-term recovery situation. And part of what I was happy to see and excited about was the fact that people that helped each other, neighbor to neighbor, are now helping each other in the long-term relief. And so we spoke with a woman named Mary Magaha, and she's going to introduce us in this video to her home that was destroyed, and then we'll meet some of the volunteers that are helping to clean it out. We'll also meet people helping to serve meals and to do counseling.
Let's go to Renee Feltz's piece, just back from Houston.
When I walked in the door, you see lots of muddy water, furniture toppled over. Everything was very wet.
Could you tell how high the water got?
It's got about 4 feet. I had a contractor came, worked for a while. Then I couldn't afford to pay him because I hadn't ran out of money. And then I got the volunteer through my niece. She had some people. I don't know how she found the volunteers, but she recommended them to me, so they came over and started helping me.
My name is James. It's a lot of work gutting the houses, taking out all the drywall, all the insulation, all the furniture and belongings, basically everything that's, below 4 feet on the house. And then, cleaning it out, doing stuff to remediate the mold, so washing the studs down and the floors down with bleach and everything. And this is at least the 3rd day that groups of volunteers have been out at this house.
That noise we hear sounds like a vacuum. Looks like the bottom part of the walls is ripped out on the drywall in the living room where you walk in.
And this is my kitchen, and this is my microwave, and I had a cooking top, and I had a built-in oven over here. And this was my sink.
There's no sink here now.
It's not. I thought I saw a sink there. No, I'm just kidding.
Just pipes. I see pipes only.
It's just pipes only. Right now, you're in my master bedroom, and right over to my right here is my bed. We had to tear everything out here, so this was my comfort zone right here. Right now, it doesn't look much like a comfort zone, but it will be. I think when you're going through something like this, you just don't realize until you go through it. I didn't cry till yesterday through all the ordeal, and it's just hard to talk about. Like I said, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. I can't explain how you would feel, but I know how I feel. Devastated to knowing that everything that you worked for all of your life is gone.
I think the effort in Houston it's going to be a long-term effort. It's not something that you're going to just clean up in the next couple days. And I think one of the biggest challenges is sort of keeping it on people's radar. I think it's important to question why the state is so eager to be outsourcing these functions. And I don't think it's an issue of wanting the state to reassert its control over relief efforts, but to sort of question the legitimacy of that entire approach to begin with, and why we're not better off in many aspects of our lives, sort of self-organizing and decentralizing these tasks, and organizing around concepts like mutual aid and solidarity and sort of basic human dignity and decency.
We've just came from visiting with a woman whose house was being gutted by volunteers. The house had no stove, no appliances, no cabinets to put any food in. You can see how it would be hard to prepare a meal there. We heard about the Midtown Kitchen Collective, and we've come to see how they're preparing prepared meals to share with people like we just met.
My name is Matthew Wettergreen, and we're here at the Midtown Kitchen Collective, and we're running a site called IHaveFoodINeedFood.com. So we built this site that's just 2 Google Forms that ask you to describe the food that you have, whether it's prepared in a commercial kitchen, the quantity, when it's ready. And then another side that's the need side for people to describe what type of food they need, how much they need, where it's going to, first responders, evacuees, things like that. So we've either arranged or picked up or cooked ourselves over 200,000 meals in the last week.
I'm Jonathan Beitler.
We're going to walk over to a station here where it looks like they're preparing
sandwiches. Yeah, we have been preparing sandwiches for the past week. We've had hundreds of people making literally thousands of sandwiches.
Now we're in a bustling kitchen.
Yeah, we're using the commercial kitchen space here at Search. We've had dozens and dozens and dozens of chefs come in, donate their time using product that's also been donated, and to create hot meals that we are giving out to people all over the city and including outlying areas like Beaumont and Port Arthur. You know, there's one thing to give them sandwiches, and that's very much a necessity when you're talking about dealing with a lot of people, but the ability to provide neighborhoods and communities and shelters with hot food that they can sit down and sit around the table and talk to each other over a hot dinner, which many of the people that have been affected by the hurricane haven't been able to do in weeks now, has been incredible. We're working really hard to make sure that we're cataloging what we've done and making it available for other communities. Other people should have this system and be able to have it set up in place prior to a disaster happening, so that once the disaster does happen, it can be activated immediately, because it's an innovative approach, utilizing technology, utilizing social media, and really everybody coming together to service a need that's not been fulfilled by entities like the Red Cross or FEMA in immediate disaster response.
And now we've made it into the 5th Ward, where we're stopping to speak with
Julia Walker. I have an organization called World on My Shoulders. We've been here mostly distributing goods. We've engaged with the public a little bit and tried to figure out how best to serve their needs. We've got another partner out and with Black Women's Defense League. They've been demoing houses the last few days, but all of those houses are places where I went to before and found out by saying, you know, you need water and you need this, and then they're like, oh, actually there's another layer, our house is full of mold. As more crews have gotten out and started distributing goods and started showing up to demolition houses and doing other things like that, I felt like I could do less of that and more of my unique skill set. And so I've been directly peer-to-peer counseling every single day. I'm trying my best to make sure that we work on actual total care, and I think that a large portion of that is dealing with the trauma and dealing with the multi-layered trauma, because these are people who are already in trauma zones and were already living fully in crisis mode and now have lost all of their assets on top of it. People are still being ignored actively because they've been passed by someone, because someone has handed them a thing. They've decided that all their problems are fixed. And that's not possible under late capitalism. It's not possible to just say that because we fed people today that they will be okay tomorrow. It's giving them the tools, fixing the immediate needs, giving the tools, and then long-term staying with them so that they can help build and then be the example for the next.
Special thanks to Democracy Now!'s Renee Feltz and to Tish Stringer for that report from Houston, Texas, and to Austin Airwaves, always. That does it for our show. Juan, tonight you're going to be in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Juan is continuing his book tour with his new book, Reclaiming Gotham. He'll be at Busboys and Poets at 5th and K in Washington, D.C., speaking with
Joe Davidson, the columnist at the Washington Post.
And then moving on Thursday to Changing Hands Bookstore in Tempe, Arizona at 7 p.m. On Friday, Juan will be speaking in Austin, Texas at 5:30 at the Workers' Defense Project. And in the weeks to come, he's headed to Newark, New Jersey, Kansas City, Missouri, College Park, Maryland, and beyond. You can check our website at democracynow.org. I'll also be traveling through Canada in the weeks to come. Check democracynow.org, our speaking events. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Noreen Shea, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis, Dina Sam Alkoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Honey Masood, Trina Nadura, Nat Needham. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.